Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiumEtSpes22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I'm very happy to welcome back a repeat customer on the blog, on the podcast. I think maybe this is his fifth, maybe even sixth appearance here, and that is the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Eduardo Echeverria, who is professor of systematic theology, philosophy and theology at Sacred Heart Seminary in Detroit, which is also where my friend Janet Smith, now retired, once
That's
taught.
right.
Yeah. So, Janet, if you're listening, hats off to you. I owe a lot to Janet, actually. She helped my career get off the ground many, many, many years ago by recommending that I get a grant from the Our Sunday Visitor Institute to
Oh,
run a conference on various things. And I did, and that really helped launch my career. But anyway, and that's neither here nor there. Thank you, Janet, for that. What we're going to be discussing today, welcome, by the way, Eduardo.
thank you. Thank you.
We're going to be discussing today a book neither one of us have written. We're discussing, I don't often do this where I interview a guest about a third party's book. And the book we're going to be discussing, we're going to be critical of. It's called Catholic Fundamentalism in America. I'll hold it up for those who are watching. Catholic Fundamentalism in America by Mark S. Massa. S.J., Mark Massa, Massasj, and it's by Oxford University Press. Now, Eduardo has written some reviews of this book. One was in the Catholic Thing, which I will post a link to in
I'm
the.
sorry, it hasn't come out yet.
Oh, it
To be
hasn't come
clear.
out yet. It
But
will come out.
it'll be
Okay,
out
and
Saturday, I believe.
all right. Well, then I will eventually post it in the comments section underneath here. But before we begin, I do want to say, in terms of full disclosure, that I actually know the author of the book, Mark Massa, S.J., Father Mark, Father Massa, because when I was doing doctoral coursework at Fordham University, 1989 to 1990, the 3 semesters I was doing actual coursework there, Father Massa was a professor of American church history there. He's a historian. And I knew him well. He was actually one of the readers on my doctoral dissertation as well, and was very, very helpful. He's bright, he's articulate, he's intelligent. He is also, quite simply, a stunningly brilliant teacher. He was just absolutely one of the best teachers I ever had, certainly in the proud Jesuit tradition of great teachers. When I was at Fordham, even though, and here's the caveat, he and I do not see eye to eye theologically on very many things at all. Father Massa is, for want of a better term, a theological progressive, a Catholic liberal, whatever sort of shorthand terms we use these days to describe folks like that. And I, of course, am a communio ressourcement guy, which marks me as, I guess, some kind of a right-wing nut job by that crowd. So I say all of that to say we're going to be critical of the book today. But I hope that, since I know Father Massa from many years ago, that he is a man who is very much open to differences of opinion, critiques, the great give and take of academic discourse. And so I hope that, should he stumble across this video, that he take it in that vein. Anyway, so all that out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Echeverria, to get the ball rolling here. I'm not going to ask you a specific question. I want you to introduce your remarks and whatever starting point you
Okay.
wish to do.
So the Catholic thing has a limit of 1,000 words. So I initially started in the first paragraph by asking whether Father, is it Massa?
Massa,
Massa,
Mark
whether
Massa.
Father Massa, when he uses the word fundamentalist, was it just a kind of a slur? Because sometimes people use the word, oh, you're just a fundamentalist. Or was there a serious argument there? And I said, yes, there's a serious argument there. I mean, clearly he's a learned man, writes well, etc. There's no it's not like oh my goodness, what is this man saying? Or where's the argument? No, there's a serious argument,
Yeah.
and the as to what a Catholic fundamentalist is. And again, when I had used the scalpel, the editing scalpel. I did away with his, he begins with references to, is it Father Feeney, Father Sweeney?
Father
Feeney,
Feeneyism. Yeah.
Father Feeneyism, and so he takes Father Feeney as, having um, five characteristics, he thinks, which he thinks is not just characteristic of Feeney's, but it's characteristic of any fundamentalist.
Yeah. And he relies heavily on various studies of Protestant fundamentalism.
Right. Well, George Marsden was a great.
Yeah.
I don't think he's still alive. Well, he's still alive, but he used to be
Yeah.
at Calvin now University, and he was a professor. He had a chair at Notre Dame. You know,
Yeah.
good.
So Father Massa is following Marsden's sort of motif in
Right.
describing.
Right.
So
Right. Right.
what are those five marks?
Well, the five marks is the first characteristic is a sectarian resistance to dialogue and collaboration. It's a kind of a citadel mentality, where you withdraw behind the into the castle and you pull the drawbridge up, and only every so often do you engage with the outsiders. You just throw stones at them, you see. So you're resistant to any kind of dialogue and collaboration because you think that's a sign of you, sort of giving up and so on. That's the first one. The second sign is overemphasizing the institutional in the model of the church, such that fundamentalism identifies the kingdom of God with the institution of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, here too, I could have discussed this, but because I think it's an overemphasis on this identification. Um, Not that there hasn't been this identification, in terms of the perfect society and all that. But the fact is, he then turns, and I don't get into it because the limitations of this article, of this column, but he then turns to embrace what I think when you come to Lumen Gentium 8, so the dogmatic constitution on the church, he thinks that when Lumen Gentium 8 says that there are elements of truth and sanctification outside the visible boundary of the church, he embraces, to me, it's totally wrong, but he embraces a multiple subsistence ecclesiology or even a kind of ecclesiological relativism, you see.
Yeah, I
He
agree.
thinks, and now that's, to me, that's not the position of Lumen Gentium, of Vatican
Well,
II.
Lumen Gentium says the exact opposite in numerous places.
Well, exactly, exactly. And even when you get to, the decree in ecumenism and so on. All right, so the third characteristic, which is the characteristic that I spend most of my column on, so let's go to the fourth, the fifth, and then we'll come back to the third. The fourth
Okay.
is that there's a focus on theology using, he says, the essentially political monikers of conservative and liberal to delineate their own position vis-a-vis mainstream American Catholicism. And then the fifth is a rhetorical style, he says, marked by apocalyptic urgency, reflecting an almost breathless, accusatory, militant tone in their denunciation of others, especially fellow Catholics. All you can, I say all these points are debatable. I mean, but obviously these one, two, four, five, they're there. I mean, it's, he discusses Mother Angelica, EWTN, all kinds of
SSPX.
yes, he discusses, which I don't do. He discusses also Eric Salmon's Crisis magazine.
Yeah.
He discusses what's his name, the guy who wrote. He was Catholic, became
Rod
Orthodox.
Dreher.
Yeah, right, right, that's right. The Benedict option. He discusses even Christendom College uh, in the
Yeah,
blue.
it really, and I don't want to interrupt your flow of thought because we want to get back to point three that you dilate on. But the fact is, one of my biggest problems with this book is it's a real confused collection of loosely associated sort of movements where it's almost like guilt by association. For example, he talks about Rod Dreher in the as a sort of run to the hills kind of
Right,
escapist, which Rod Dreher is not. That is the classic misunderstanding of Rod
right, it's
Dreher's
true.
Benedict option. That's not what he's saying. But then he goes on to in a sense discuss the SSPX in that chapter, as if Rod Dreher is advocating for the kind of religiosity that the SSPX represents. And so that's the kind. It's almost like a kind of almost a smear uh,
Yes,
without any evidentiary basis
right.
whatsoever.
Yeah, so in fact that's in part two, and he uses the typology of Richard Niebuhr. So in his mind, this is the Christ against culture type, you see.
Yeah,
Um, but it's interesting, the in part three, Christ the transformer of culture, another Niebuhrian type, he has there Christendom College, as I said, Crisis Magazine, Eric Sammons. Eric Sammons actually wrote a column responding. He told me he didn't read the whole book. He just read that section in that chapter where Eric is criticized. And
it's
then of
like
course,
you focus on yourself in a group photo.
yes. And then of course, church militant,
Yeah,
what's his name?
Mike Voris.
Mike Voris, I was never.
Very few of us ever really cared for Mike
Oh,
Voris.
I remember initially here because he started here in Detroit, and I remember he asked me to come in to give some kind of assessment of some of the videos he was doing, and I just
Yeah.
said no, I'm sorry. Also, and in particular with respect to ecumenical relations, I just said no, I'm sorry. This video um, doesn't really understand
No.
unitatis
So
integratio,
yeah,
etc.
the point is Mike Voris does represent a kind of scorched earth Catholicism
Yes, yes.
that
So you can find
might
that.
legitimately fall under the category of Catholic fundamentalist. But then
Yes, yes,
Father Massa goes on to say he doesn't logistically, theologically, historically, in my opinion, historically, properly connect the dots he's trying to connect.
no, no.
It's like a sawed-off shotgun scattershot approach. You got
Yep.
Mike Voris, you got Rod Dreher, we
Yeah,
got
yeah.
Christendom College, you got EWTN, blah blah blah, and never there's no Ariadne's thread that he establishes that
Right,
actually connects all of them. I
right,
suppose he would say that they all evince these five marks in some way or another,
right,
but he doesn't really then systematically show how each one of these people he's mentioning, like Eric Sammons, falls under those
right,
five marks. Anyway, go
right.
ahead.
So then the third, which is the most, in my view, the most important characteristic, which is going to make a lot of even John Henry Newman, I say, is going to be a fundamentalist for him. But
Yeah.
the third characteristic is that fundamentalism has an ahistorical understanding of church teaching, such that, quote, the meaning of church teaching could not change. And then he says there was a resolutely ahistorical reading of Catholic Christianity in which development was not possible because it represented apostasy from faith once delivered. And I say this third point is so basic to Massa's understanding of Catholic fundamentalism that he takes it to be the controlling metaphor of Catholic doctrine as the quote unquote deposit of faith that seems to imply an unchanging and unchangeable list of positivist propositions that cannot develop or unfold over time. So for me, that was the most important characteristic. The other ones, yes, of course, here too, you can also find people that have an ahistorical understanding, people who think Aquinas said it. That's it. We don't we don't need to
Yeah.
find another way to put it. Okay. So I then go on to say that see he looks at the phenomenon of change, and he tries to explain that phenomenon in terms of, and I couldn't get into this either, but in terms of Kuhn's notion of paradigm. Um,
I want to stop there
Yes,
eventually
we
and talk.
can.
I want to talk more about Kuhn. I'll just say it now. I
Yeah, go
mean,
ahead.
I'm a little bit surprised to see Father Massa appealing to Kuhn's notion of paradigm shifts. It's an older idea by now, and it's sort of not quite in vogue as much as it used to be. Even, I mean, Kuhn, originally applied his notion of paradigm shift to the progress of science. That it isn't
Right.
just a linear progression
No,
from
no, there's no linear
superstition.
progression, at least
That
early
it's all
Kuhn.
just shifting paradigms and
Right,
models
right,
and theories and
right,
so on.
right, right.
But even
Normal
in
science, as he calls it.
yeah, but even in the philosophy of science today, there have risen critical voices of
Oh,
Kuhn's thesis,
oh,
uh,
absolutely.
and to apply it to then theology without further ado,
Right.
I think is also a bit. I mean, we could talk about it, but I think it's a category error. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I'm teaching Trinity Christology now, a graduate course. And I said, I discussed actually this column in my class one night, and I said, if you apply this Kuhnian notion of paradigm as Massa understands it, you see that the Nicene Creed is working under a paradigm, metaphysical, homoousia, and all that becomes outdated because it was, to use Kuhn's term, it was normal science at the time in which the Nicene Creed, Chalcedon was written, but that's no longer the case. And then, of course, so I say the upshot of his appeal to Kuhn is to embrace an unqualified epistemic fallibilism. We can be fallibilist with respect to, there's always more to know. But as I go on to argue, I think Christians can only be qualified fallibilists. So we have to make a distinction between the propositional truths of faith and their formulation. And so we can deepen our understanding of those propositional truths, but he rejects. He thinks that propositional truth and all of that is still tied to a kind of a view in which doctrines don't change and all this. So the upshot of his appeal to Kuhn is to embrace an unqualified fallibilism such that all beliefs are open to revision. We cannot know anything definitive and final. He embraces also an anti-realism, which is one of the big things that Kuhn was criticized by. The
Yeah.
sort of he was a post-positivist, and then you know Karl Popper and Michael Polanyi and Imre Lakatos, all these people, they and uh, other American philosophers, they all criticized Kuhn's notion of paradigm and his notion, since there was no linear development, and you know, there's no reality there in terms of which science actually justifies its claims, you see. And I don't understand how Father Massa could embrace an anti-realism as an implication of Kuhn's paradigm, meaning thereby that there is no independently structured reality to explain and interpret. And then and then the other way that he explains change, and this is actually more problematic for me because I think he doesn't understand Lonergan. Because the essay that he appeals to, which is a 1967 essay, The Transition from a Classicist Worldview and Historical Mindedness,
Yes. Okay. Go with this. I wanted to really hit this.
he takes it to be an either or.
Yes.
And I think
Historical
Lonergan,
consciousness versus ahistorical consciousness.
yes, right.
This is such a bad dichotomy.
It is a bad dichotomy. And Lonergan doesn't embrace it. If one read that article carefully, and if one went on to read, Lonergan has a look. I think Lonergan, as we often say, Lonergan drank the Kool-Aid around 1970. Most of his stuff before then, I think even theological method, there are good things in that. In fact, in theological method, Lonergan's reading of Vatican I is classicist because he makes this distinction between propositional truths of faith and their formulation. And he thinks that the formulations, can correct, can amplify, and so on and so on. But he's
Yeah.
not an anti-realist. He thinks you can know truth. He thinks it's unchanging. Um, and he has, that brilliant essay that he wrote, The Dehellenization of Dogma, where he's defending propositional truth against the Canadian Leslie Dewart, who had written this book on the nature of belief and all that, or the future of
Yeah.
belief. So Lonergan is defending propositional truth. He's defending a realist view of truth. So I just think you can't use
Well, yeah, it's just shocking to me because here, Father Massa, brilliant man, he's appealing to Thomas Kuhn in just completely undifferentiated ways, as if that this hasn't been problematized by even philosophers of science.
right,
And now he's appealing to the old and mostly discredited Hellenization thesis, that the church of the first centuries, or millennia was a classicist, ahistorical church of
right,
metaphysical gobbledygook that is in many ways contrary to the concrete historicity of the order of salvation presented to us in the narrative of Scripture, which
right,
now in the modern church we're actually retrieving the category of history. You go and read the church fathers, or even go read the ancient Greeks, to insinuate that they were not acutely aware of the problem of temporality. The problem, they may not have called it history or whatever, but they were aware of the relationship between the one and the many, between the
right,
eternal and time, between
right.
change and changelessness. And Greeks may have had
Aristotle. Maybe you could
Aristotle.
say that about, maybe you could make a critique of Plato that way, but Aristotle was interested in change. Um,
Yeah, he was. But even Plato takes account of change. It's just negative.
right,
Okay, Plato's divided line, and then
right,
you get into Middle Platonism, and there's more of a
right, right,
monistic kind of element. But yeah, I mean, this is just utterly simplistic
right,
analysis of the development of Catholic dogma over 2,000 years as we had up until 1962 to 1960 we had a classicist view, but now in the past 60 years we've evolved into a proper intellectual adulthood where we now take history into account. This is just garbage. I'm
You know,
sorry, it's
even
garbage.
uh, even David Tracy, the who wrote this famous book on the achievement of Bernard Logan. He wrote many things. He was at University of Chicago.
Tracy was great, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I
So,
disagree with much of it, but
oh yeah,
yeah.
I disagree with much of what he wrote, but he was a smart guy. He says at one point that classicism. He says it's not about the propositional truths of faith, it's about their formulation, he says, and thinking that you can't formulate something differently. So, um, if I could just, so I say, Massa says, for the classicists, the truth remains substantially the same throughout history. For classicist believers, right orthodox belief are necessarily static realities. It's always about static realities.
Yeah.
For the historical minded approach, everything is shaped by the changing circumstance of history. Massa's appeal to historical mindedness involves denying the enduring validity of truth. To me, that's historicism. According to Massa, one cannot take the phenomenon of change of doctrine seriously if you hold truth to be propositional and objective, timelessly and eternally true. This view of truth reflects in a historical and static understanding of doctrinal truth, he says. And I then say, given this emphasis on historical mindedness, Catholic Christianity is about a perpetual reinterpreting and recontextualizing of the gospel. That's that
Yeah.
that's what it's about.
And that's problematic, isn't it?
Oh, of
I
course it
mean, I
is.
mean, I'm reminded of a video I once saw of Bishop Barron, where he said, the church cannot be simply an endless debating society.
Right.
It just can't be that.
Well, unfortunately, that right now, well, in fact, I wrote about this in a column for the Catholic thing a couple of years ago when there was they were trying to discuss, well, what is synodality and all that. And the way that synodality was understood, I said, reminded me of an essay that Ratzinger wrote in 1975, where he described the idea after Vatican II that that's what it was about, what you just said, that it was a continuing discussion, formulating of what there's no content of faith, no revealed content of faith, no revealed truth. We're just engaged constantly in having the discussion about what that content is, you see.
About elemental things, about constitutive things. I'm not
That's
talking
right.
about shutting down conversation I'm all about conversation. But
Sure.
there have to be certain non-negotiables. The
Right.
Trinity, the divinity of Christ, the atoning death and so on.
Right.
These
Right.
things are open to vast, profound, deeper insights, but
Sure.
they are non-negotiable in their essential propositional truth.
Right. There's
Christ is
always
consubstantial with the Father.
Right, right. There's always more to know, I say, but then
Yeah.
what we know has to be consistent with what we already know to be the case. We can't possibly think that it's all, that's what an unqualified fallibilist is. It's all open to, uh, change in that sense. It's all open to revision and et cetera, et cetera. So I say this emphasis on the phenomenon of change leads Massa to misunderstand the issue of doctrinal development. A theory of doctrinal development is one, and then I quote Aidan Nichols, who says, is one which allows for genuine development in doctrine, yet respects the substantial homogeneity of revealed truth. And then I say John the 23rd adumbrates this theory in his opening address at Vatican II. Gaude Mater Ecclesia, in that famous passage where he's actually quoting Vatican I, and Vatican I is actually referring us to Vincent of Lorenz from the Commonatory. So John said, for the deposit of faith, in brackets 2 Timothy 1:14, the truths contained in our sacred teaching are one thing, the mode in which they are expressed, but with the same meaning and the same judgment. So idem sensu, idem quae sententia is another thing. And the subordinate clause in this passage is part of a larger passage from Vatican I, Dei Filius, and this passage is itself from the Commonatorium, chapter 23 of Vincent of Lorenz, where Vincent says he's talking about, is there no progress in religion? And he makes a distinction between progress or development and change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Change is when one thing becomes something else. Development is when, the identity of the thing that is developing stays the same. It's like when people say, oh, I remember Cardinal Marx from Germany said, well, of course, there can be change in doctrine. And of course, he didn't make the distinction between development and change. And so there you have people who think, well, same-sex marriage is really just a development,
Yeah.
and so of course they don't understand that there's a dogmatic conceptual hard core when Jesus says, when he's asked in Mark 10 about divorce, and he refers us back to the creation text of Genesis 1:27, God created man in his image, male and female, he created them. There's no spectrum there. It's male and female, he created them. Therefore, a man shall leave his mother and his father, cleave unto his wife, and the two, well, which two refers back to male and female, the two shall become one flesh. And so sexual differentiation is a fundamental prerequisite for the two to become one flesh. That's fundamental to the
Yeah.
understanding of marriage. Marriage is a yes, love is the integrating principle of marriage. Marriage is an ethical community or even a covenantal community, but it's grounded in sexual differentiation. It can't be separated from that. So Vincent, when he asks, is there no progress in religion? Yes, there's progress, there's no change. And then he says, therefore, let there be growth and abundant progress in understanding, knowledge, and wisdom in each and all, in individuals and in the whole church at all times, and in the progress of ages, but only with the proper limits, he says, within the same dogma, the same meaning, the same judgment. Again, idem sensu, idem quae sententia. Um, I say the French Catholic theologian, because he does. See, here's another example. Massa, he keeps referring us to the Nouvelle Théologie as if somehow they're on his side, as if it's all about.
Yeah, this is problematic.
Yeah, it's also problematic. So I say Yves Congar, the made a cardinal by John Paul II, 1904 to 1995, a Dominican. For one, he has argued that this distinction between propositional truths of faith and their historically conditioned formulations summarize the meaning of the entire Vatican Council too. In fact, he discusses this in his book on the history of theology.
Yeah.
Although the propositional truths of faith may be expressed differently, we must always determine whether those new reformulations are preserving the same meaning and judgment of truth, and hence the material continuity, identity, and universality of those truths.
Yeah. Yeah. My problem, I mean, in one sense, he's altogether correct to say that there was a liberal wing to the ressourcement movement, guys like Yves Congar, although Congar was much more traditional in the early years. He sort of drank the Kool-Aid too, starting in the 1970s. Nevertheless, there was a rift that developed after the council between the
Right,
concilium and the communia wings of
right, right,
ressourcement
right.
to such an extent that I would say that now the liberal faction that became concilium no longer should even be called ressourcement because they moved
No.
way beyond the sources, all right? Resourcing, scripture,
Right,
fathers.
right,
And so
right, right,
they
right,
just unhinged themselves from that in this fallibilist direction
right, right.
that that the church is an endless debate. So there is this confusion of development versus change that involves just reversals and contradictions. So that's the deeply problematic thing that I think Cardinal Newman would certainly disagree
Now,
with.
I think whenever, Congar sort of lines up with Concilium, I think his book on true and false reform in the church is a great book.
It is a great book.
He has a great discussion of these matters.
And he
Uh,
remains far more orthodox than, say, a Skillebex or a Kung or,
right,
or even
right,
the later
Abs
Ronner. Yeah.
absolutely. So I then say irreformability of propositional truths of faith implies that they cannot be reversed by future developments, but this does not exclude reformability of the mode of expression of the content or meaning of these propositions. Several times, Massa alludes to John Henry Newman's well-known 1845 work. He never discusses it; he just alludes to it. And he alludes to that passage from Newman. To live is to change, and to live long or is to change often. But he
Yeah.
doesn't really tell us what that's all about. He just quotes it. Massa's reflections on change are not consistent with this work. Indeed, Massa's reflections would consider Newman a fundamentalist. Newman is concerned with distinguishing true and false doctrinal development. And then, all the so-called tests, uh, identity of type, continuity of principle, assimilative power, logical coherence, fecundity, conservatism, and vitality. They help us to distinguish development from change, which Massa confuses. That is proper growth in understanding propositions. I don't know why they don't understand propositions. It's kind of like a boogie.
No.
Propositions are sort of a boogeyman for them.
Well, stop there for a second because I think you're really onto something. That's a great term to use, Eduardo, boogeyman, because I mean, I hate to say this, but there's a certain rhetorical move going on here in this book. There is an agenda, and it is the agenda of the modern day Catholic left. And that is to say that if you are in favor of the idea that the church is in possession of certain unchanging truths,
Right.
that makes you anti dialogue, static, ahistorical, all of those things,
A
propositional,
fundamentalist.
a fundamentalist.
The church is
And,
fundamentalist. The
and
catechism is
that and
fundamentalist.
there yeah and that is precisely what we cannot be, and therefore all of these things that you fundamentalists think are irreformable are reformable. And let's do that. Then let's have women priests, let's have gay marriage in the church,
Right,
all
right,
right, let's have
right,
a pluralist vision
right.
of all religions are
So the
essentially on
same.
the
Right,
same path. And so
right,
let's
right,
have
right.
that whole ball of. Now, I'm not saying Father Massa endorses all of that. I'm saying though that this is this is the matrix, the
Right,
context
right,
in which I think this book is swimming.
right.
Uh, and you know, you can't help but reach that conclusion when he engages in such facile comparisons of static propositionalist versus open-minded,
Or
dialogue-oriented.
what's the other word he uses? Um, a unchanging and unchangeable list of positivist propositions that cannot
Yeah.
develop or unfold
What
it.
does that even mean? Does it mean
I,
that we're not allowed to hold that anything is actually objectively true?
yes,
So
that's what it,
if I say that I believe that Christ is in fact consubstantial with the Father, with all due respect to the deep profundity of that and the
right,
billions of
right,
pages of ink that have been spilled on
right,
what that
right,
means,
right.
if I say that that is an irreformable truth, does that make me a fundamentalist?
Well, whether he thinks or not, the scheme that he's working with would imply that you are
That I'm a positivist,
that
that
you're
I just
and
think
that
that
you're
that's a little factoid, a little nugget of truth.
well and
You know,
static. It's
yeah,
it's a static truth, man. And you think if you think something is unchanging, then it can't be. I mean, I don't understand. It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, for some, I don't know, 15, 1600 years, theologians, Orthodox theologians have been reflecting on Nicaea, Chalcedon, the basic truths, fundamental truths of Christology and so on. It's not as if even Lonergan himself wrote, you know, uh, great a great book on Christology, and so it's like you say, it's all facile. It just in the end, this is where fundamentalism turns into a kind of a slur
yes,
and not a serious argument any longer.
that's the thing. That's why I like your word boogeyman.
Yeah,
And I'm going to shut up here in a second, let you do more
sure,
talking.
sure,
The
sure.
fact is that I think that it's a shame that he engages in these kinds of facile binaries, because I think there is a certain segment of the modern Catholic Church that does fall under the category of a kind of ecclesiastical fundamentalist. They exist. I mean, in the radical
Oh yeah.
traditionalist movement, they exist.
Or
You're right.
I sometimes refer to them as ecclesiastical positivists.
Yeah,
People uh, people who think that the way to settle a conversation is just simply to cite church teaching,
yeah,
and not. I've had these kind of conversations with others, people that but and I'm not going to use their names in this,
yeah.
but
But
it's
or are they're selective? They'll say like, this is what the Council of Florence said, and this is what the Council of Trent said. Now here's what Vatican II says. Therefore,
right,
Vatican II is wrong, and
right,
we can
right, right,
reject it. No, no. Here's what you now have to do. Now you've got a theological problem on your hand.
right,
Now you've got to figure out, where is the development here? What
right.
is the Ariadne thread that ties this all together?
Or for example, one of the examples I often give is 1928, Pius XI's Mortalium Animus. It rejects ecumenism. Vatican II, some years later, embraces ecumenism. John Paul II, and 30 years later, in Ut Unum Sint, embraces ecumenism. So
Yeah,
then they'll think, they want you to believe that Mortalium Animus is normative, whereas Vatican II isn't. It's whatever pastoral or whatever it
yeah,
may be. And so they don't see it as a question. How do we understand, um, the fundamental continuity between these texts without denying that there's some kind of reversal
yeah.
in the sense
Yeah,
that the church came to embrace ecumenism.
that's right. I mean, Monsignor Thomas Guarino, in his book, The Disputed Teachings of Vatican II, deals
Right.
with many of these reversals, like at Vatican, and he talks about Vincent of Lorraine, and he definitely he doesn't try to sugarcoat the fact that there have been some reversals, but he shows very, very clearly that the reversals are in the service of a deeper continuity, which is
Exactly.
why. It's so important to keep going back over and over and over again to the hermeneutic provided by Joseph Ratzinger, Pope
Right,
Benedict,
right,
when he
right,
said that, yes, a hermeneutic of continuity, but we also need to talk about a hermeneutic of reform, which
right,
means that for the sake of a greater continuity, there might be little micro ruptures or micro reversals,
right.
adjustments to church teaching here and there that we have to take into consideration. So when you and I are talking here and criticizing Father Massa, when we're talking about development versus change, we are precisely not arguing for a kind of ecclesiastical positivism.
No, no, no. No, because in fact, I often say uh, Unitatis Redintegratio um, rejects the branch theory of Christianity, where you have the trunk is Christianity, you have all these branches,
Yeah.
Catholics, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Anglican, and so on. Well, Mortalium Animus rejects that. It rejects ecclesiological relativism, a multiple subsistent ecclesiology. Well, that was rejected also by Mortalium Animus. There's all kinds of ways to find an underlying continuity. Ratzinger famously said that the church found a way, at Vatican II, the church found a way within the logic of Catholicism to have a commitment to ecumenism, so that at the end of the day, there's still only one church. Um, but
And
we,
see, and there's the connecting thread, right, Eduardo? Like you go back to earlier church statements that were against ecumenism. What those church statements are really trying to say is we can't be indifferentists, we can't be relativists,
exactly,
we can't buy into the branch theory. The
right,
Catholic Church is the Church of Jesus Christ.
right,
And they
right,
wanted to emphasize that in a period of time when the church was being besieged by all these things. All right, okay, but that in the effort of defending that truth, it in a sense had an exaggerated negativity
right,
towards.
right. That's what what's his name, Cognar says. There are two ways to be one-sided. You see. And
Yeah.
Pius the 11th was one-sided because he rejected ecumenism. He never asked himself, well, what is ecumenism? He just took ecumenism the way it was understood at the time in the 1920s, with World Council of Churches and all that. And of course that the church rejected that. So you have to ask yourself, um, here's the thing I often say to my students. I say, anybody who says that outside the visible boundaries of the church, all you have is an ecclesial wasteland or emptiness,
Yeah.
doesn't know what he's talking about, has never read in the more than 500 years since the
Yeah.
Reformation, has never read any, theologians. I mean, even like modern 20th century theologians like Wolfhart Pannenberg and one that needn't agree with everything that comes out of the mouth of Willem Banneker or Karl Barth or whoever.
Right.
But these people, I always go back to the Decree on Ecumenism, paragraph 17, where it distinguishes between the propositional truths of faith and their formulation, and it says we're not surprised if one tradition or another has a deeper grasp of the revealed mystery that we share. And that deeper grasp can be formulated uh, better, and so that can contribute. And of course, I know that there are Catholics that would rather cut their throats or their wrist, or to say this, that someone like Wolfhart Pannenberg can actually contribute to a deeper understanding of the Catholic faith, you see.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or I think a free church thinker like Yoder
Yoder,
on
right. In my
you
own
know.
background, Berkhauer and Herman Bavinck and Kuyper and all of these thinkers, like Kuyper wrote a three-volume, he always wrote three-volume works, a three-volume work on the Lordship of Christ. And I say, we also confess the Lordship of Christ. We have a solemnity, but I think Kuyper's three-volume work gives us a deeper understanding of Christ's Lordship. Now, uh, this is what John Paul called receptive ecumenism. Ecumenism, he said, was not merely an exchange of ideas, it was an exchange of gifts. But the gifts were at the level of formulation. They weren't at the level of, you know, the truth itself, as if we don't know about Christ's lordship. So I think that what's his name, Father Massa. It's in the end, it's a superficial understanding of the church's idea of ecumenism, a superficial understanding of
Yeah.
how you can engage in ecumenical conversation with with theologians, Barth, Bunnenberg, many others. And I often say to my students, ecumenism presupposes that you can actually say, wow, I learned something here,
Yeah.
as opposed to this kind of, this first characteristic of being, sectarian resistance to dialogue and collaboration. John Paul says in his Ut Unum Sint, we have to get beyond the adversarial mentality, not because there aren't logically incompatible positions, not because there isn't a what do you call it, an ecumenical apologetics. I mean, Levering
Yeah.
on the Assumption wrote a great book, which was receptive ecumenism, but it was also ecumenical apologetics.
Very much so. I mean, one of the problems with the ecumenical movement, which I think derails a lot of conservative Catholics from embracing it, is that it almost came to seem as if the only real goal of ecumenical conversation between Catholics and Protestants was reunification or intercommunion.
Right.
And so there was always attempt to buff off the rough edges of differences in order to accentuate. Well, and I think at one time there was, unfortunately, that emphasis. But in reality, the value of the ecumenical movement is that reunification is going to be a work of the Holy Spirit. I mean, we're not going to be able to
And
do it
it's an
over.
eschatological. We're a
Yeah.
pilgrim church, so
Yeah.
it's
The value, though, is mutual friendship and respect. The
right,
value is learning something from one another. The
right,
value is to collaborate on those things about which we can agree and about which we can collaborate. But the goal is not reunification. I mean, down the road, eschatologically, yeah.
right,
Uh,
right, right.
because the
Well, and
fact
we
is
have
this,
to
and I tell
acknowledge that.
people, go ahead.
I was going to say we have to acknowledge that there are, however much you can have, an appreciation, and I do for, neo-Calvinists, for instance, and so on. There does come a point in the conversation where one acknowledges that there are these incompatible claims about the
Yeah,
papacy, even about sacramentology, and so on. Anyway, so
yeah, and I think
to me,
people
to
get,
me, this to me,
yeah,
Father Massa's view leads you to a kind of, you're not really going to have a genuine conversation.
yeah. Well, if all truth is still sort of just up for grabs and
Right.
things, especially then truths of ecclesiology. The normativity and binding nature of magisterial teaching on a whole range of subjects is now just sort of tossed out the window. That's harsh, but just treated with, well, that's just one view among many.
Well,
Uh,
exactly. So I go on to say, when I say that Newman would be a fundamentalist according to
yeah,
Massa's view, and in fact, these criteria or these tests, I know that Newman also, sort of was reluctant in a second edition of his work to use the word test. But they do help us to distinguish development from change, which Massa confuses, proper growth in understanding, propositions, which may involve correction, modification, and complementary formulations. This is here again. This is Lonergan says this in his work on the way to Nicaea, the dialectical development of Trinitarian theology. Um, In particular, Newman says, quote, a true development is that which is conservative of its original, and a corruption is that which tends to its destruction. The continuity of principle and identity of type, or what leading Reformed theologian Oliver Crisp calls a dogmatic conceptual heart core. is what Newman refers to when he speaks of what must be conserved. Fundamental to doctrinal development is the idea of propositional revelation. Newman held that revealed truths, which he called supernatural truths of dogma, have been, quote, irrevocably committed to human language. God's written revelation, according to the late Ian Kerr's reading of Newman, necessarily involves propositional revelation.
Oh,
The,
so true.
the propositional revelation in verbalized form, or what Newman called the dogmatical principle, is at once true, though not exhaustive. Um, you know, it's accurate, but it's not exhaustive. And that just leaves open, like when St. Paul talks about his about Jesus' death on the cross and so on. He doesn't work it out for you. He lays out the fundamental truths that have to be affirmed uh, in one's Christology, but there's more to talk about, more to think about, and so on. Uh, Newman says the dogmatic principle is at once true though not exhaustive, imperfect because it is human, he adds, but definitive and necessary because given from above. And then I conclude by quoting Cardinal Muller, uh, who takes this to be the vision of classical Catholicism, which presumes an epistemic realism. We can know the truth. Doesn't mean that there isn't more to know, but we also, in
Always.
knowing the truth, we know the truth about reality. So, Cardinal Muller says the realistic view of God's revelation and saving will, which embraces the whole human being, implies a realistic epistemology and insight into the identity of truth and reality. That doesn't mean there isn't more to know.
See, exactly. One of the things that I find most troubling about this book, and by the way, the reason why this book is important is because I think it is timely in the sense that in the era of Pope Francis and synodality, whatever you think of those things, one way or the other, the fact is it's almost as if issues that we thought were settled are now being relitigated. Points of view have been re-empowered that we thought, it's like the 70s all over again.
Right.
And so that's why it's important to talk about these things. But the fact is the objectionable thing is the description of orthodoxy, of those of us who believe in timeless uh, truths. They're reformable in one sense, in terms of expression, but timeless truths are static thinkers, proposition. What that undercuts is precisely what you just said. There's always more to learn. In other words, when I say Christ is consubstantial with the Father, is that a conversation stopper or a conversation starter? It's a
Right.
starter. Does that
Well,
close my mind to deeper truths, or does it
no,
explode my mind and open
of
it to
course, of
far
course.
deeper truths,
And how
to
many people,
contemplation?
how many theologians, philosophers throughout the centuries, as I said earlier, have continually reflected on, if you start with Augustine's reflections on the Trinity, how many centuries and so on have there even, you know, have
Yeah,
have, have there been reflection and a mystery? I always say when we talk about mystery, it doesn't mean that it's like a something that's shrouded in darkness and we can't know it. No, it means that there's always more to know. But what we come to know has to be consistent with what we already know to be the case.
that's right.
We
Well,
can't
this,
we can't say, well, we now know, as I'm in this course I'm teaching on Trinity and Christology, of course, you have those that abandon Chalcedon. Um, and they're historicists and they're anti-realists and they think talking about homoousia and all of that's a dead end and et cetera, et cetera. So we can continue to deepen our understanding. So in that sense, we can have epistemic humility, but of course, that doesn't mean that there are things that we know to be the case, period. Not, well, it's open and so on
Yeah,
and so
yeah. Uh, we do have epistemic humility in the face of the mystery that is God. Uh, that's just such a calumny to say that those of us who hold to certain truths are these static thinkers, not open to mystery and so forth. I want to go back to something you said earlier too. You know, the necessary putting the faith into words. Nobody wants to reduce the faith to mere words. But on the other hand, there is a kind of apophatic agnosticism about the deeper significance of words in books like this. It reminds me of modernists like George Terrell, who made
right.
this distinction between the ineffable pre-linguistic experience of the grand mystery of God and then the doctrines and the words that come later. And
Right,
he even
right,
meant
right,
that with
right.
regard to both scripture and doctrines. Now, George Terrell did not mean that to say, therefore, we don't have to pay any attention to scripture or tradition. He actually held both to be important. But there is that wedge that then gets driven. Ronner talks about pre-linguistic, and yet we look at the scriptures, you know, Christ is the Word. En
Right,
arche en ha logos.
right,
In the
right,
beginning was the Word,
right.
logos, and we
Right.
constantly, so we need to read to deploy a deep and profound metaphysical understanding of the importance of linguistics of words.
Well, and reality. Words refer to things
Yes,
and reality because it's easy to consider yourself sort of trapped in this circle of interpretation, and there's no way out of it. You just
the
you work.
opposite then would you inevitably end up in some deconstructive nightmare
Right,
where
right.
all rational thought is veiled power struggles and so a
And
veiled grasping after power and all that.
reality recedes behind your interpretation, my interpretation, somebody else's. And so it's a sort of a hard perspectivalism where you can't really talk about reality. At the end, I say regarding Massa, I say that he's really a neo-modernist because because he rejects classical Catholicism for all the reasons that we've talked about, particularly
Yeah.
having to do with that third category. He rejects it as fundamentalist, making him a neo-modernist. And then I identify modernism using the words of Pius X in Lamentably, um, where he says, truth is no more immutable than man himself, since it evolved with him, in him, and through him. And Massa, Father Massa, in restating this modernist thesis, is restating this modernist thesis in his book. And so I mean, John Paul II, Benedict the 16th, all the great,
Yeah.
Hans Urs von Balthasar,
Yeah.
these are all fundamentalists, you see.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, I mean my dissertation was on von Balthasar, and like I said, Father Massa was a reader, and even though he was an excellent reader, had very insightful things to say, and was very friendly towards me in writing, it was very clear that he thought Balthasar to be a reaction, which is why, by the way, I think it's so funny that traditionalists seize upon Balthasar's problematical "Dare We Hope" and thus
right,
equate him as a crypto-modernist, when in
right,
fact, it took me a while to get my mind around that because most of my career, I was in all these liberal academic institutions, and Balthasar was thought of as a fundamentalist, as a
right, right,
Catholic right-wing
right,
reactionary
right, right,
because he supported Humanae Vitae and
right,
male-only
right,
priesthood.
right.
But I want to come back to something. We're sort of running
Sure.
out of time, but I want to come back to something which I think is important. We talked before about how affirming certain basic truths like the divinity of Christ, the eternity of the Trinity, and so on, is not a conversation, but a conversation starter. It opens us up to deep. It explodes our minds. It expands our categories. I want to add then to that the flip side of that, the irony is that all of these people that are constantly talking about truth as change, 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 end up embracing the rankest kind of uh, dogmatic dogmatically held truths that are so close-minded, drawn from modern contemporary culture. You and I
Yeah.
are both old enough to remember when in the 70s, for example, when liberal prelates and priests got in charge of anything, they became the most dictatorial, dogmatic,
Right.
close-minded
Right.
jerks on the face of the earth. There's only one way, and it's this way.
Right.
All right. And all of you rosary, you know, praying, adoration going types need to get on the change train.
Right. No, I agree with you. Again, that's the irony that I
Well,
remember
it's
one
like Bloom's book, The Closing of the
of the
American
American
Mind.
Nominee. Right.
I mean, that's the great irony of our time, that the people that spoke the most about open-minded dialogue and change were the most dogmatically and viscerally closed-minded people you'd ever want to
Right.
meet.
Right. Right. I remember many years ago when I taught at Malloy College in Long Island. It was run by the Dominican Sisters of Amityville. Sadly, they were lost, of course.
Yeah.
I used to say, Aquinas and Catherine of Siena as Dominicans would not have recognized themselves in in the sisters their version of Catholicism. But there was this one priest there, may he rest in peace. And he was so close-minded. I mean,
Yeah.
he just thought even things like the historicity of the resurrection. He thought, come on now, or the virgin birth and things like that. In his mind, you see, he didn't seem to realize that he was actually uh, providing a context in which the next generation was going to reject
Yeah.
Christianity, Catholicism.
Yeah. Yeah, in reality, when the group that speaks the most of change and postmodernism and paradigm shifts and all this, in reality, it masks over still a fundamental modern impulse, born of the Enlightenment, fact value
Right,
distinction, and
right,
embracing of secular reason as the
right,
paradigm of
right.
truth, of the barometer of truth. All right. And so underneath it all, when they say change, dialogue, they don't mean that. What they
No,
mean is we wish to be able to deny a set of traditional beliefs drawn
right.
from transcendence and the church, and we wish to
No, they weren't.
replace those beliefs with modern secular values.
The I remember the sisters there and other faculty. They weren't. Once they discovered who you were, that you were a sort
Yeah.
of a traditional Catholic, they didn't want to have conversation with you any longer.
Yeah. Now, that's not actually Father Massa. Father Massa, in my experience, was willing to talk to anybody, and a very, very, just a really pleasant man and a really
Right,
intelligent guy. And if he were to sit down with the two of us and have a conversation, we'd have a strong argument. There'd
right,
be a strong, but he would be very congenial. So I don't mean to imply that, he's one of these dogmatic, look, shove
right.
this down your throat kind of guys, because he wasn't.
But
Uh,
his views in this book are
yeah.
such he doesn't want to have. You get the idea.
No, no,
But
the book is really not very good, I think.
even though Oxford University Press published it,
Yeah, that's, yeah, yeah,
but
yeah. I mean, he draws out the worst examples. The Father Feeney's, the
right,
SSPX.
right,
And he and Mike Voris. He draws out the worst examples and holds that up as this is what it means to be a traditional Catholic.
right,
I think that's just unfortunate.
right.
Well, do you have any last words on Father Massa's book or the
Well,
topic at hand?
as I often say to students, I mean, there's nothing wrong with reading books like this, but you have to read them critically, and you
Yes, you
have to
do.
examine the presuppositions of the book.
The book
Uh,
is written well and it's
oh,
easy
it's a
to
good,
read.
yeah, absolutely.
And you
And
actually can learn something. Like I learned a few things about the history of Archbishop Lefebvre and the SSPX. I learned a few things
well,
in
and
reading about them.
honestly, I didn't know who this what was this guy's name? Uh, Gomer de Pauw.
Oh, Gomer de Pauw. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I had
I didn't
actually
know.
heard of him,
I
but
had
I
no
hadn't.
idea who he was.
Yeah. He was kind of big when I was in the seminary, and a lot of the really right wing guys were about Gomer de Pauw. Yeah.
But again,
Uh,
it's the whole he says on page 55, he says the Roman Missal of 1570 was his seeming ahistorical and static understanding of the unique status of that latter book. It always comes down to ahistorical, static,
yeah,
et
yeah,
cetera, et cetera. And so you can't really make claims. I don't know how I can't imagine Gomer DePaul. I'm sure he would defend himself because when
yeah,
you think that you actually can know the truth about reality, even if you say there's always more to know, um, in his in what's his name's mind, it's in the mind of Massa, it's as if if you make assertions that you think are true, unchangeably true, these positives, you think that there's no room for development and so on and so on.
yeah.
So it seems to me that the fact is, if you look at the people, that are contrary to that claim, even his own, oh, Newman. Newman thought that there were unchangeable truths, et cetera, et cetera. In
Yeah,
not just in development of Christian doctrine, his essay Grammar of Assent,
yeah,
university sermons and all that. So it's as if somehow we're supposed to think, oh, when Newman said, to live is to change and to live long is to change often. Oh, so
yeah.
Newman must be a kind of a historicist. He
Well,
must be.
even Newman's development of the concept of the illative sense
Yes,
is designed to show how even if there can't be dogmatic certitude, through an intuitive adjudication of a converging set of probabilities, we can
right,
reach a certain moral certitude as to
right,
the truth of certain
right, right,
things.
right. Yeah, and the fact is, Newman's his theory of rationality, it's so much more complicated than the way that one sort of comes away thinking
Yeah.
when you read Massa. Although, as I say, he doesn't really. He several times he refers to Newman. In fact, he uses this term plastic, doctrinal, so as if somehow it's sort of malleable and blah blah blah.
Look, Newman described a Catholicism infected with the spirit of modern liberalism, big L liberalism.
Right,
He described that as a different religion.
right.
You know, yeah. So to employ Newman to justify the notion, hey, we can have gay marriage now. Not that Father Mass is doing that, but
But his position, whether
yeah,
he says that, his position is open to that, the way he
yeah.
talks.
One would think, one
Yes,
would think.
but who
But
knows?
anyway, who
He
knows?
might. But the fact is,
He doesn't mention it, and so let's give him, let's
we'll
not
give
go
him
there
the
with
benefit
regard
of
to
the
that
doubt.
book. But
But
anyway, okay,
if you worked with his framework,
yeah, that's the point.
you could come up
Yeah,
with
and there are people like Father James Martin, another
yes,
Jesuit, who work
exactly,
with that framework, who constantly talk
exactly,
about change, 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 who do
exactly.
want that.
Cardinal,
I mean, Father Martin denies that he wants the church teaching to change, but it's very, very clear
yeah,
to any
that's
honest observer that he
yeah,
does.
yeah, that's
All right, but anyway, I don't want to end on that sort of speculative note.
no, no,
By all means, get the book, read the book, make up your own mind. But I do
right.
believe that Eduardo's analysis is of the book, which is a critical analysis, I think is accurate. So
Thank you.
thank you, Eduardo, for coming on the
Well, it's
show,
my
Doctor.
pleasure. My
And
pleasure.
it's
Always
always
a
great
good
having
time.
you on the show.
Thank you,
And
man.
and
Good to see you. I'm glad you're
good.
you're feeling better.
Yeah, the constant battle with the sinuses, but I'm
Okay.
I'm hanging in there. All
Thank you
right.
very much.
Thank
We'll,
you,
we'll see
everyone.
you
Thank you
soon. All
for
right. Take
listening.
care, brother. Bye
Bye.
bye.